knowledges, if there's more than one. But let me stay with the singular for the moment. Well, it's a phrase that one comes across very often in the literature. But what exactly does indigenous knowledge mean? I want to tackle the question of words that we pick up without fully understanding or developing what the meaning is. Now, according to the dictionary, indigenous knowledge, indigenous means it's native to a particular region or place. It belongs to a particular area. So what would this look like? Knowledge that belongs to a particular area. I've just been reading a book called The Golden Road by William Dalrymple, and in that book he argues forcefully and convincingly that for 1,000 years India was the centre of ideas, transmitting ideas to the rest of the world. In particular, he suggests that the monsoon winds blowing between India and Arabia, and the monsoon winds blowing between India and Southeast Asia, the other side of the Bay of Bengal, these routes carried trade and knowledge and information that originated in India and travelled extraordinary distances and with great influence. Obviously, we know very well that religion, Buddhism, was transferred from India to Southeast Asia, perhaps overland to China, or by sea into Southeast Asia. But along with Buddhism went a lot of other information and knowledge about astronomy, about mathematics particularly. And if you say now, today, in Europe, what knowledge did we gain from India? It's outstandingly zero is mentioned. The symbol zero to represent nothing in numbers, but actually the whole system of 10 digits, 0, 1 to 9, that are used in mathematics, in accounting, in business, in all sorts of sciences. Those numbers were a revolution in being able to depict the very large and the very small, with simply by extending the number system you could create any number that you liked. It's quite magical. At the same time, the trade between India and the Red Sea ports, and particularly that connects into Roman Egypt, so that the Indians were in contact with the Romans, and there are hordes of Roman coins found in Sri Lanka and in all parts of the southern coast of India. There are very extensive trade links that can be quite clearly established right the way from Rome, indirectly through India and to China, and that Dalrymple's thesis is that the sea route between India and other places, was the route of choice for trading, much simpler than the overland route, which took you through the Himalayas, took you through areas of the globe that were controlled by hostile peoples, bandits and robbers. The road journey was much less safe than the sea journey. Well, so Dalrymple makes a convincing case that there was trade, that there was transfer of religious ideas, and the religious ideas affected in both directions the influence of India on both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire between the years of about 200 in the Common Era to about 1200. Very extensive influence trade and religion, astronomy and mathematics, strongly influenced by Indian wisdom that was passed to other parts of the world. Around 1200, there starts to be a decline in this trade, that the Indian empires are becoming weaker. There's a rise in China, and then from 13th century onwards, there's a direct land link thanks to the Mongol Empire. The politics and the fragmentation of this northern route were overcome. There's a unified political entity in the north here, and the land route became simpler and easier. And it's from that time on, the 13th century onwards, that we get this influence of China, the influence that's been well traced by Joseph Needham, the transfer particularly of technology from China to Europe, first through Marco Polo to Italy, but to Europe generally, that we see the Joseph Needham identifies the transfer of the compass, the printing press, paper, gunpowder, those technologies being transferred from China westwards. But Dalrymple's case is that before there was the Silk Road, before the Silk Road was even thought of, since the words originated in the late 19th century, there was the Golden Road, that where India disseminated knowledge and information. Dalrymple's less clear about the technology that can be attributed to the Indian culture. One item that he does mention is the stirrup. The stirrup where you put your feet for riding horses, so important in developing transport for messages and small packages, but not particularly terribly useful for transporting a quantity of material that was being spices being transferred to the Roman Empire in exchange for jewels, cloth coming from Southeast Asia between Southeast Asia and India, massive trade for which ships were important. But Joseph Needham made the case that those technological introductions from China to Europe kick-started the Renaissance and eventually the Industrial Revolution. Dalrymple is augmenting that idea that there were earlier influences through the Red Sea to Rome, and after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Arab Empire was established, took much of that information, garnered the information from Greece and from Rome that was neglected in Europe during the Middle Ages, when the Middle Ages Europe reverted to barbarism. The Arabs maintained that information and created a second route through Spain into southern Europe, and that transfer of knowledge that had been garnered from China, from India, and passed on to Europe. So what we're looking at on this map is the difficulty of locating a single source of knowledge. The knowledge that is being generated is being generated by an admixture of people from different regions and different areas. And by the way, notice that Europe doesn't even exist on this map. It's worth mentioning perhaps, there's a TED talk by Ron Eglash who talks about the influence of African mathematics on Europe, the fractal, random, chaotic, non-random, chaotic number generating that's used in divination in Africa is transferring its influence on Georg Cantor and the number systems that are used in today's computers, all of that transferred from Africa to Europe. Europe is not a source of knowledge, but it's very difficult when you talk about knowledge to identify, oh, it comes from this place or that place. So what is exactly being said when we say that some knowledges are indigenous? Well, it's being used in kind of shorthand, and it's being opposed to Western knowledge, or European knowledge, as a kind of shorthand for the knowledge that has been spread, a universalizing knowledge that has been spread across the globe in terms of modern technology and modern science, and that it's obliterating and damaging and rubbing out, erasing indigenous knowledge, the folklore and wisdom that is known in other parts of the world. And I think we need to be very careful here because, look, Western knowledge is not particularly Western, in the sense it's not particularly European. The basis in terms of numbers, algebra, technology, the ability to produce, use horses as beasts of burden, to develop gunpowder, all sorts of things have come from the East to Europe, where Europe has aggregated these things together and made something different. It's the cross-fertilization of ideas, it's the mixing of different cultures that makes valuable knowledge. It's not rooted in a particular area. So what do we mean by indigenous? Well, I'm going to try and make some sense out of that, because it's clearly being intended as something. It's being intended as colonisation, it's being linked with colonisation, and it's being suggested that European culture, through colonisation, is destroying or has destroyed local knowledge. Well, local knowledge can happen anywhere. I mean, I live in the UK, and when my grandmother used to look out of the window first thing in the morning, she would say something like, rain before 7, fine before 11. So let's have a look at what she meant. If that's something like Great Britain, most of our weather patterns, most of our weather comes in from the southwest. The prevailing winds across the whole of Great Britain are from the southwest, bringing water vapour from the Atlantic through the country, and in the passage of that weather over those weather patterns over Great Britain, a lot of that water vapour condenses to become rain and falls somewhere over the country. And the second thing to know about that is that the patterns that produce rain are normally low pressure areas that are associated with cold fronts that bring rain, and those low pressure areas move in such a way that to get from where the weather pattern starts to arrive to where the weather pattern leaves, the time it takes to move through a point is roughly 4 hours. So if you look out the window and you say, oh, it's raining, that's the leading edge of a weather pattern, then 4 hours later you'll be looking at the weather pattern leaving you. So when my grandmother looked out the window, she said rain before 7, fine before 11, what she meant was, if it's raining now, we're in a weather pattern which will be gone in 4 hours. And that's local knowledge, that's local indigenous knowledge, but notice that I've offered you an explanation of it in terms of general meteorological principles. The two things are not necessarily in conflict. Of course, I would be a lunatic to now go to another part of the world, to go to a monsoon area of South India, to go where the prevailing winds are dictated by the monsoons. I'd be a fool to go to Mexico City in the rainy season. In any of those other conditions, I would be stupid to say this rule of rain before 7, fine before 11 works wherever I go. Of course it doesn't. But the principles of anticyclones producing weather patterns work for typhoons in Japan or Pacific storms in Southeast Asia, hurricanes in North America. These patterns do apply with local variations across the globe. So what we're really saying about indigenous knowledge is it's specific to a particular area, it involves a number of rules of thumb that work and are perfectly adequate, but it's not in conflict with a universalizing science that explains things in terms of general principles. Of course, general principles do not apply everywhere. General principles need to be adapted to local circumstances, and perhaps one of the things that people who speak about indigenous knowledge are complaining about are those Europeans who went to other parts of the globe and expected everything to work just as it did in Europe. Of course, if agricultural advisors go from Europe to India and try to get the people in India to grow things the same way as they grow in Europe, of course it doesn't work. Of course it's nonsense. The universal knowledge needs to be adapted to differentness. Equally, when European people went to Australia or India and imposed a curriculum that was suited for people in England, of course it was nonsense. It should not have happened. But to tie together the idea that Western universal knowledge is necessarily in conflict with indigenous knowledge seems to me to be a grave mistake. And the second thing to say is tying colonisation with this, well, there's a problem here for me, because in actual fact there is and has always been a link between scientific knowledge and warfare. Gunpowder gives you great power in order to exert your influence over other people. Weapons of destruction can be powered by gunpowder. And warfare has always been an influence in the development of science, from Newton calculating the trajectory of a cannonball through his scientific method, via developments in plastic surgery worked out during the Second World War, treating airmen who'd been terribly burned in aircraft, through to the present day when drones are being used in active warfare. Of course, there's a link between science being applied in war and also science being developed during periods of war, because war provides the pressure. So of course Western science has been associated with war, but part of that link is that Western knowledge, or universal knowledge, or knowledge which is applicable in very wide range of places, gives power, and that power can be used both for good and for evil. And we see in colonisation many cases the knowledge was being used for absolutely evil purposes, but that's not actually, or it's to overstate the link between colonisation and the universalising of knowledge. One of the issues of concern to people who have an interest in indigenous knowledge is that with the spread of a homogeneous, supposedly Western culture, traditional languages, and along with them traditional wisdom, will be lost. And of course, that's a legitimate concern. It's a serious issue. But in a way, it's inevitable that languages will change. It's happened with English and French and other European languages. You can see in the work of Newton, as he's writing about the development of a science of mechanics, he's struggling to put concepts into words that have never been put into words before. He's having to distinguish between acceleration and velocity, momentum, kinetic energy, those different words, different concepts where previously the single concept of motion had been sufficient. And any language that encounters modern technology must change in order to embrace new concepts. And users of a language will have to accept that either the language will change by adopting new concepts, inventing new, embracing new concepts, or the people who speak that language will have to adopt another language for dealing with modern technology. And it continues to happen with European languages. In my lifetime, words like spreadsheet, word processor, algorithm have been coming into use. The English language has been developed and extended in this way as it has through centuries, as it's adopted words for algebra, for bungalow, for magazine, for veranda, words borrowed and taken from other languages and incorporated it into it. English has changed in the last 400 years, and other languages are subject to exactly the same kinds of pressures. So yes, of course, we want to maintain knowledge, but we won't maintain knowledge by arguing in a way that's not got nuance and subtlety. Indigenous knowledge is compatible with a universal knowledge at some level or another, and we have to find a way to deal with that without simply opposing indigenous knowledge to a demonized Western science, which isn't actually, as I've been saying, Western at all.